Finalization is the return function of an observable, and that function is guaranteed to be called when the observable either completes or errors, or when a subscriber unsubscribes. To see finalization in our code, we can add to the observable's execution, we can have it return a function. Now, the finalization function is very powerful, but for now, just to see it in action, let's have the finalization function console log a statement. We currently have a call to the unsubscribe method 1 second after the observable's execution begins. So if we take a look at the console, we see the finalization console log. We see that because the subscriber has unsubscribed. And one of the conditions under which the finalization function will occur is upon a subscriber unsubscribing. Now let's take a look at finalization occurring upon observable completion. I'll comment out the unsubscribe call. And we'll change the error call to a complete method call. And we'll go back to, when we go back to the console, we see that after the completion notification, we see the finalization console log. And that finalization is occurring because the observable has completed. Lastly, let's show that the finalization function is called when an error occurs. Let's change the complete method call back to an error method call. And going back to the console, we see after the error notification, we do indeed see the finalization console log. So with that, we see that finalization occurs after observable completion or erroring and after the subscriber unsubscribes. The last 5 items in our list all deal with the observable entity called the producer. The producer is anything that is the source of the values that are emitted by the observable. In our current implementation, we don't really see an actual producer, and that's because we're creating values on the fly that are being emitted from the observable. To really see the producer in action, we're going to have to modify the code a little bit. The first thing that we need to do is create a second subscriber. And we'll call that subscriber 2. We'll also need to remove all but one of the next notifications. And now we'll create a producer which will produce the value that will be passed on in the next notification. We'll call the producer, and we will use the random function to generate a randomly generated number, which we will then emit in our next call. And if we go to the console, we'll see that we have 2 subscribers and they are both receiving different randomly generated numbers. And that's because the producer is inside the observable's execution, and each subscriber has its own observable execution. Therefore, the randomly generated numbers are different. When the producer is inside the observable execution, we call that observable a cold observable, which is the next item in our list. And a cold observable is just an observable whose producer is inside its execution. The producer inside the observable's execution also does what's called unicasting. Unicasting is when one producer is observed by one subscriber. Cold observables are always unicast, and we see that because each of our subscribers receives a different randomly generated number. When the producer is outside the observable's execution, we call that observable a hot observable. And you notice that with the hot observable, both subscribers receive the same randomly generated number. And the producer of the randomly generated number is what's called multicasting. And that's when one producer is observed by many subscribers. So we have two subscribers that are getting that one randomly generated number from the producer. Hot observables are almost always multicast. If you remember when we discussed finalization, I mentioned that finalization has a much bigger implication than the way in which we're using it currently in our code, in our example. And that has to do with the observable's producer. I've modified the code so that we now have a set interval. We're using a set interval that every 3 seconds creates a randomly generated number. And that randomly generated number gets console logged. As well as being console logged, the randomly generated number is being emitted by the observable. Now I'm going to comment out the subscriber code. And notice I've commented out the callbacks, and that's to reduce the amount of things being shown in the console. So what we see is every 3 seconds we have 2 randomly generated numbers being logged. And this is what's called an ongoing process. The producer is infinitely producing randomly generated numbers. Now this is the kind of thing that we would want to terminate upon finalization. We'd want it to be terminated when either the observable completes or errors, or when a subscriber unsubscribes. So now let's go back to the code and let's have our finalization, instead of logging a console statement, let's have our finalization function perform a clear interval on the ongoing process that's producing our values. Now we'll also, in order to have the finalization function run, we either have to have observable completion, observable erroring, or a subscriber unsubscribe. So let's first have subscriber 1 unsubscribe after 9 seconds. And let's go to the console. So we see 2 numbers generated, another 2 numbers generated, and then a third 2 numbers generated. Now we're only seeing 1 number being generated, 1 randomly generated number being generated. And that's because one of our subscribers has unsubscribed. Let's also have the subscriber 2 unsubscribe after 9 seconds. And when we go back to the console, we'll see 2 randomly generated numbers, then a second set of randomly generated numbers, and a third set. And now we see that the randomly generated numbers have terminated. And that's because both of our subscribers have unsubscribed. And because of that, the finalization function has been called to terminate the ongoing process in both their observable executions. Now, instead of, let's comment out the unsubscribes, and let's create a set timeout that 9 seconds after observable execution calls the complete method. And when we go back to the console, we see 1 set of randomly generated numbers, a second set, and a third set. Upon the observable completing, the finalization function has run, and we no longer have that ongoing process producing randomly generated numbers. Let's change the complete method call to an error method call. And let's see what happens. We should see the same result. We should see 3 sets of randomly generated numbers, and then the process terminate. And indeed we do. This is how the finalization function can be very useful indeed. If we have an ongoing process in our observable execution, such as a process that produces an infinite number of emissions, we can have that process terminated, both upon observable erroring and completion, as well as subscribers unsubscribing. And with that, we've come to the end of our Observables Primer. I do want to leave you with 2 final thoughts. I've stated it previously, and I can't state it enough, that it's really important to understand each of these entities, actions, and concepts, as they will be coming up when we learn the individual subjects and operators that we cover in the course, some more than others. Some of these concepts show up more than others, but we will address each of them in future lessons. The second thought that I'd like to leave you with is about unsubscribing. So we've seen how producers can produce values infinitely within our observable execution. We should always unsubscribe to any subscription that we create in our code. That ensures us, because finalization and thus teardown or any termination of ongoing processes will happen upon unsubscribing, we always ensure that that occurs by unsubscribing to all of our subscriptions. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. And to stay updated on the latest content from the RxJS workshop, please subscribe to the channel. Do you want to learn more about the RxJS library and many of its features? Please check out my course on the Udemy platform. It's called RxJS Subjects and Operators, What They Do and When to Use Them. You can find the course by clicking on this link on the channel page. Thanks again for tuning in to the RxJS workshop.